has scared me so much that I don't want to keep the car anymore.
10 days after Fiona, thousands are still without power, some of them alone and a long way from help.
I just wait to see if somebody comes.
This is The National with Chief Correspondent Adrienne Arsenault.
Thank you for being with us. We want to begin tonight with some breaking news in Quebec, where it is Election Day. After 5 weeks of campaigning that saw the leaders of 5 main political parties courting votes and competing to form government, tonight CBC News has projected a winner. And that is François Legault's Coalition Avenir Québec for a second straight majority government. Alison Northcott is in Quebec City tonight at CAQ headquarters. Alison, this is a pretty big win, but not a surprise.
It's not a surprise the CAQ had been the front runner throughout this campaign as they aimed for this second majority. And the majority was projected just 10 minutes after the polls closed, just to give you a sense of how strong the CAQ has numbers have shown this evening. And they campaigned on a promise to put more money in people's pockets, to improve the healthcare system, to protect the French language. And their slogan throughout the campaign was continuons, or continue, and that is what voters have chosen to do tonight. Already they are elected or leading in 90 ridings, and that's already a larger majority than they had in 2018.
So, Alison, we've been talking as well about the race for second place there. How is that shaping up tonight?
Well, that is one of the big questions, is who will be the official opposition. And right now we see the Liberals leading towards second place, but still with fewer seats than they had going into this campaign. The Souverainist Parti Québécois, a dominant force in Quebec politics for decades, is leading or elected in just 2 ridings right now. So if that holds, that will be the party's worst showing in that party's history. Quebec Solidaire, the left-leading Quebec Solidaire, and the Conservatives not really getting the kind of evening that they wanted to see tonight, not really getting the boost that both of those parties wanted. The Conservatives are not leading in any ridings right now, and all of the popular vote amongst those second place parties appears to be sort of spread amongst all of those other parties. Well, the CAQ, of course, has this majority projected this evening.
All right, Alison, thank you. We'll keep an eye on this throughout the night. Ottawa is taking new aim at Iran tonight over human rights abuses as that country cracks down on a growing protest movement.
The goal is to make sure that we put maximum pressure on the Iranian regime. That's why we came up with these key sanctions targeting the leadership of the RGC. Everything is on the table.
So the new sanctions affect 25 individuals and 9 entities, and among them, Iran's Revolutionary Guard and the country's morality police. They are blamed for the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini. She died in custody last month, sparking protests across Iran and around the world. Now, the protests inside Iran have been met with an increasingly brutal response, but that's only served to energize people around the globe, including in Canada, to demonstrate in support. That's where Sasha Petrusek starts his story tonight.
The issue has mobilized Iran's diaspora in Toronto and around the world. Here they support Ottawa's new sanctions, but say Iran's leadership needs to be hit harder.
What we would like to see is for that to expand to include the entire organization and for it to be placed on the terror list.
A crackdown on Iran in response to the crackdown in Iran, where protesters remain defiant.
This is a one-way road for us, because if this settles, if the dust settles and we stop protesting, they are going to kill even more of us.
Anger echoes through Tehran's Sharif University and on the streets, where security forces are quick to strike back, even at those just taking their picture. More than 130 have died in the past 2 weeks of protests, sparked by the death of a 22-year-old woman after she was arrested by Iran's so-called morality police. Mahsa Amini was accused of not wearing her hijab properly. Iran's supreme leader says her death was a bitter incident that deeply broke his heart. Still, he blames what he calls U.S.-backed rioters for attacking the police and his government, a signal for many that the crackdown will only intensify. The protests have been powerful because they also express Iran's middle-class anger over economic pressures. But it's likely not enough to bring down the regime, so long as security forces remain loyal.
That's always the critical element. I had to pick one. Are the police and the army willing to fire on their own people? In some countries, they are not, and that's where revolutions succeed. In other countries, they are.
In Iran, the shooting and the protests continue. Sasha Petrusik, CBC News, Toronto.
We're going to stay on this. We'll have more on this a little later in the program, including a first-hand account from a woman who has been arrested in Iran herself. Her story, plus the calls for fundamental change, in about 20 minutes. In Indonesia tonight, more than a dozen officers are under investigation after 125 people were killed in one of the worst stadium disasters in history. So 125 people were killed. Again, 30 of those victims were kids. And this was the scene outside the stadium as mourners prayed for all those lost. Officials say many killed were trampled or suffocated when police fired tear gas inside the stadium, triggering a stampede. Fans who were there have reported some of the exit doors were locked. The government says officers suspected of wrongdoing will face criminal charges. In Atlantic Canada, tens of thousands are still without power, 10 days after Fiona tore through. For those affected, patience is all but worn out.
I know people are frustrated, and I know how much we would all like to move beyond this, and I know there are still thousands of islanders without power, and even though progress is getting made, it's not fast enough. It's never fast enough.
Maritime Electric says more islanders should be back online by midweek, with most outages fixed by Sunday. Meanwhile, thousands are still in the dark in Nova Scotia as well. The provincial utility says some customers may have to wait until Wednesday. Living through Fiona was hard enough, but having to wait so long with no light, no heat, no refrigeration, that is taking its own toll. And as Kayla Hounsell shows us, some aren't just frustrated, they're getting desperate.
We're 185 kilometers northeast of Halifax on our way to Moose River, one of many communities in Fiona's path of destruction. We're going to see Nettie Fraser, who's pretty tucked away out here on her own.
How are you doing?
Oh, surviving, right?
She weathered the storm alone, too.
Pretty scary. This is the worst storm I ever saw in my 90 years.
And for the 10 days since, she's had no power, no heat, and no running water.
Some water for you, Nettie.
Greg McDonald is a volunteer firefighter.
People haven't got washed properly, haven't ate properly. It's just been a long time.
He made a list of seniors to check on after the storm.
How many fridges and freezers did we save just because we took the generator down and put it on for 6 to 10 hours, and then we go on to the next place and do the same thing.
He says landlines are still not working, and there's no cell service here, even at the best of times.
What would you do if you needed help with something?
I just wait to see if somebody comes. So, be no other way.
Power crews are working day and night to restore electricity, but they say the damage is unprecedented and the work complex.
Uprooted vegetation, taking out poles, breaking poles in a way that where we usually have to repair sections of our equipment, in this case, we're needing to rebuild sections of line.
On Prince Edward Island, crews are also scrambling to get the lights back on. And for some showing up to this comfort center to get a shower, the timeline is a moving target.
Yesterday almost felt like Christmas in the afternoon because we all thought we were getting it back. Mm-hmm. Big disappointment. Big chunk of coal today.
Nettie Fraser is taking her flashlight to bed for another night.
I hope they come soon.
Power crews did arrive today, but the estimated restoration is still another 2 days. Kayla Hounsell, CBC News, Moose River, Nova Scotia.
The devastation is ongoing in Florida, where they are assessing the damage done in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian. At least 100 people have died, a number that is expected to rise. More than 500,000 homes and businesses remain without power. More than 100 boil water advisories are in place right across the state. Now, Thomas Douglas shows us the hard question being leveled tonight to officials in the hardest hit county. Why weren't warnings in place sooner?
All along Florida's mangled shoreline, those searching for survivors are increasingly finding bodies, with more than 50 killed in Fort Myers and surrounding Lee County alone.
It's heartbreaking for all those families, for all those businesses. That's why I'm very sad.
Last week, as neighboring communities told people to get out, Lee County waited, issuing an evacuation order just the day before the hurricane hit. Now it's suffered more devastation and deaths than anywhere else.
When making decisions in a disaster, emergency management directors do not have a crystal ball.
Officials stress other areas were predicted to be hit harder in earlier forecasts, deflecting accountability, even pointing to those who stayed put.
We got that message out at the right time. Now, whether people listen to it, we can't force people out of their homes.
By the afternoon, 500,000 customers were still without power, many of them bound to be waiting most of the week for electricity. Some lined up for water and ice, much needed in the Florida heat.
We finally got water last night. But it's yucky water.
In some communities, it can be hard to tell where the shoreline ends and the Gulf of Mexico begins. Tall trees pushed aside by Ian, homes seemingly suspended in the sea.
People need to take care of their emotional and mental health because we're really going to need to work together on this.
The cleanup is only beginning for what can be recovered. The list of lives lost is getting longer. The human cost still growing. Thomas Dagg, CBC News, Toronto.
Now to British Columbia, where the concern tonight is the lack of rain. Over the past several weeks, it's been so dry and so warm that parts of the province are dealing with drought. Renee Filipponi explains why that could pose problems in the months ahead.
We are making a test.
With unusually warm temperatures and not a cloud in the sky, it doesn't feel like fall in Vancouver.
You should have brought a bigger bucket.
This grandmother is taking advantage of the summer-like conditions, but says it's unsettling.
Which is a bit scary for sure. Like I see crocuses in our neighborhood. We live in East Van, and crocuses are popping up, and I don't ever remember that happening in October.
The skies across the region have been hazy for days. It's the result of smoke from this fire near Coquitlam. Burning since Saturday, crews say they have slowed its growth. But the Minikata fire is not fully contained. There has been little to no rain for weeks across BC. Parts of the province are under a stage 4 drought, meaning the conditions are extreme.
So we're kind of running out of water. It's been a very long period, and all the things on the deficit side are still going on, and we don't have anything on the plus sides.
UBC professor John Richardson says this bog is normally filled with water this time of year. He says the dry weather is hard on the forests and spawning fish, and it could also lead to unstable land when it finally rains.
Many soils, if they've been dry for a long period of time, become hydrophobic, which means that water will just bounce off them. And it takes a while for the water to actually start seeping in. And that very early stages, that means that water that's hitting is going to run off really quickly.
But for now, this warm weather business is taking advantage of it.
Like last weekend, we were almost sold out of the jet skis, and we had like maybe 4 or 5 more dock workers than we usually do. So yeah, definitely an uptick in business.
And there is no rain in the forecast. Rare in October, one of the wettest months of the year in BC. Renee Filipponi, CBC News, Vancouver.
In a history-making agreement, an Ontario First Nation is getting some land back. It involves the federal government and the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte Band Council. And as Olivia Stefano shows us, it will see the return of 120 hectares.
Nancy Kimmett's family is on the front line of a land claim battle over who owns this property and how it's used.
In 2007, prior to the occupation, it was a fully operating quarry.
The land is part of a tract of unsurrendered Mohawk territory that the Crown illegally granted to someone else in the 1800s. The Kimmets have been dealing with the fallout for years.
It's really just been living in a dangerous environment because there's been no policing, and we have been, had crops destroyed.
Now, an agreement that may bring some peace.
This land has been a source of conflict for decades. And even though these fields and the quarry down this road will be returned to the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, this only resolves part of the dispute.
The 120 hectares is only a third of the outstanding land. The town of Deseronto, Ontario is built on some of the rest.
We are looking for the lands to be returned.
The chief says he's made a financial offer to town residents, but the number of landowners there makes it all more complicated.
I want to acknowledge in your language that Canada failed to protect your community and your right to this land.
The partial settlement deal also includes almost $31 million for loss of use.
I see this as nothing but a scam, a rip-off.
But it all angers some community members who say they put their lives on the line, blocking roads and rail lines to get this land back. They don't like where it's going now.
The Mohawk people are the owners of the land, not a federal institution such as the Band Council. The people own the land.
Even though this part of the land claim appears to be settled, the fight over its full resolution is far from over. Olivia Stefanovic, CBC News, Deseronto, Ontario.
The British government is backing out of one of its key budget policies. But as Chris Brown shows us, the reversal on an unpopular policy isn't playing so well either.
When it comes to a government backpedal, this was a biggie from the British Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng.
I get it. We not only talked to people, we saw people's reactions.
What Kwarteng did was a U-turn on a tax break for the wealthy that was part of his recent mini budget. It sent markets into turmoil. The pound sank and mortgage rates soared.
Making the credibility hit worse was that the new PM defended the plan just 24 hours previously.
I do stand by the package we announced, and I stand by the fact that we announced it quickly because we had to act.
None of it is going over well with the Conservative faithful who are gathering for their annual convention.
Abandoning it does show a lack of power, if you like.
This way for the U-turn. The political opposition is seizing on it too.
It was obvious they weren't going to get this through the House of Commons. They were forced into this screeching U-turn.
Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's initial few weeks have been probably, among the most disastrous I've ever seen from a new government.
Political scientist Tim Bale says it's not a great start for Prime Minister Liz Truss, who's been in power for less than a month.
Anyone who thinks that Liz Truss is out of the woods by making this U-turn is very much mistaken. I think there are a whole bunch of policies that she intends to put forward, that she's already suggested, that will be very unpopular with the public.
British businesses are feeling the whiplash too. At this boutique clothing store, the struggling sterling adds to the cost of importing fabric.
Some of the banks are thinking that the pound and the dollar might be on a parity by the end of the year, so I feel like I should just pay my bills as soon as possible.
I have repaired this.
Harder to tell is how much the government's doing an about-face on the tax cut will improve things. Chris Brown, CBC News, London.
Toronto is seeing a dramatic rise in auto thefts and carjackings, leaving so many on edge.
It's really scary because they were so close. I mean, like, they're in my house, in the property.
A CBC News investigation looks at what is driving a huge surge. Next. Doctors are going public about an issue they say is happening far more than we think.
For someone else, my symptoms may not have been significant, but for me, I almost died.
An investigation into underreported and preventable maternal deaths. Plus, an old genre breaks new ground.
It's nice to be validated and get to do a story that's a little closer to my heart.
The rom-com making room for more diverse voices. We're back at 2.
I initially thought it was a joke, actually, that it was my research group who made an elaborate joke, but then it sounded a little too convincing.
No, not a joke. You are looking at the newest winner of the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Swedish geneticist Svante Pääbo won for his discoveries about human evolution. He pioneered techniques to retrieve and analyze Neanderthal DNA. Today's win, an honor for sure, but not actually a first for his family. His father won the same prize back in 1982. We have some new data tonight showing an alarming and growing problem in Canada's largest city. Across Toronto, car thefts are surging far beyond what the city saw just last year. Farah Morali now on who police believe is responsible and how they're trying to get it under control.
It's a brazen crime happening in neighborhoods across Toronto.
So many cars are being stolen.
Including Patricia Lee's. Security footage shows 3 people trying to steal her Lexus SUV from her Toronto driveway in July. One person tries the door handle. 2 others cover the headlights. Shortly after, an alarm goes off and they run away. Just months earlier, surveillance footage from a neighbor captured her other vehicle stolen from the same place.
It's really scary because, you know, they were so close. I mean, like, they're in my house, in the property.
Toronto is facing a spike in car thefts this year. There have been nearly 6,500 so far, about a 45% increase already from the 4,500 reported throughout 2021.
It is staggering. It's a very, very large number.
Toronto police have launched a new unit which will be tasked in part with tackling this trend. But they say a big reason for the increase is that with pandemic supply chain problems easing, there are suddenly more new cars to be stolen.
The manufacturers now, I believe, are delivering vehicles that, from what I understand, hundreds and hundreds of orders had come in and were unable to be delivered. So it's simply a case of a higher supply.
Investigators believe most thefts are targeted by organized groups.
The biggest profit is really to export them outside of the country. So we have a real problem, and it's a problem that's organized. So that's where we have to come in.
That's where the car was parked.
And luxury cars aren't the only targets. This woman's Honda CR-V was stolen 10 days ago.
A police officer came to the house later that day and informed us that we were one of 6 CR-Vs that were taken within the last 2 days.
Systems. Brian Gast's group tracks car theft data and says that crime has a wide impact.
And it affects all Canadians. It affects premiums.
After a spike in thefts from their neighborhoods, some community groups took matters into their own hands.
We do the Neighborhood Watch program, and that was all part of it, is to try and communicate prevention techniques. But there's just only so much people can do, and that's really the problem.
As for Lee, she says she no longer feels safe driving her Lexus in Toronto.
It has scared me so much that I don't want to keep the car anymore.
She plans to take this car back to the dealership. Farah Morali, CBC News, Toronto.
As protests continue to sweep across Iran, there are growing concerns about the intensifying crackdown. Coming up, I'll speak with a woman with first-hand experience of standing up to the regime. Plus, a CBC News investigation looks at maternal death and why it might be happening far more than we think.
environment.
There have been large protests in Iran before, but some say the current demonstrations just look and are starting to feel different. In the face of a brutal government crackdown, protesters have not given up. In a moment, we'll hear from an Iranian human rights activist. But first, Ellen Morrow looks at how it got to this point.
This is the moment that triggered the upheaval taking over Iran, the arrest of Mahsa Amini by the so-called morality police for wearing her headscarf incorrectly. Amini died in custody days later, her family accusing police of beating her. They deny it. Her death has become a flashpoint, Iran's long simmering tensions now pouring out into the streets, one of the fiercest displays of opposition to the country's hardline leadership ever. Protesters say they're fighting for their freedom and they won't back down. Don't think it's just today, these students chant. We're gathering every day.
Some people have erroneously tried to say that this is the hijab protest. This is really a wrong characterization. This is a movement about freedom of choice.
There have been uprisings against the Iranian regime, its strict interpretation and enforcement of Islam in the past. Just 3 years ago, thousands protested, calling for the overthrow of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. In 2017, women dubbed the Girls of Revolution Street tied their hijabs to sticks, waving them in the streets of Tehran. And in 2009, it was the Green Movement, or Persian Spring, a mass protest against then-President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. None have loosened the grips of Iran's clerical rulers in charge of the country since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Before then, Iran was a secular society, no enforced dress code and no strict religious laws. Professor Shahrzad Mojab was a women's activist in Tehran in the early days of hardline clerical rule.
Is this moment a tipping point, do you think?
I hope it is. There has been a massive cultural political change that I think that it would be difficult to sort of return to what it was in the past.
Mojab and others point to how widespread these protests are, how they're bringing together different groups of society angry at the country's leaders and suffering in an economy hobbled by sanctions. Consider this video, dozens of drivers honking in solidarity with student protesters as security forces raided the campus of their university.
Here's a situation where, frankly, people of different ages, generations, backgrounds, political persuasions, have really come together, and they've remained unified over the broader consensus of needing to reclaim Iran and to reclaim a free and tolerant Iran.
The regime is fighting back. Dozens have been killed in the clashes, a number likely to rise. Still, there is hope that this time, change may come. Ellen Morrow, CBC News, Toronto.
So these protests in the wake of Mahsa Amini's death have clearly gone far beyond concerns about women being forced to wear the hijab. They are about oppression and the economy and human rights. Shaparak Shajarizadeh is a women's rights activist who's been arrested for defying Iran's hijab laws. Shaparak, thank you for being here. It was really important that we talk to you because I know you've been there. You've literally been on those streets protesting this law. You've been arrested. You were beaten in the same prison where Mahsa died. And I'm wondering, can you help us understand how brave is this act these people are taking?
These young women, they are very brave. They are fearless. Even for me, I was in awe when I first saw the footages and videos from Iran. For me, it was a dream to see all the women in the streets unveiled one day all together, but watching them burning their scarf, actually the symbol of suppression of women, the symbol of systematic violence against Iranian women. It was It was a dream come true.
So we're now talking about the largest, most widespread protest in the history of the Islamic Republic. You know, at the time when you were there, people around the world watched. But this dynamic feels different. What is it about either these women largely or this moment that's different?
Mostly, like Iranian people are fed up with poverty, like crushing currency, at the same time seeing oppression on women, violence against women, the footages of women beaten up in the streets every day, like suppression of oppression on minority groups, corruption by the government. So at the same time, with the motto, women, life, freedom, they are chanting down with the dictator. They want the regime change, and it's been happening for several years so far.
So we've sat in this spot before, looking at protests around the world, Hong Kong, the Arab Spring. There's always been the sense that this time it's different, this time something's going to change, and then it doesn't change. In part, that's because those governments have been so strong. But how strong is the regime there now? Can it withstand this? Is it going to crush it, in your view?
The regime's behavior is not going to be different, but we see that the regime is weaker. It's never been weaker before. At the same time, many people are in the streets, students, high school students, university students, women in different cities, and at the same time, worldwide support from people around the world. Yeah, I'm hopeful, and I think this is going to be the beginning of the regime's downfall.
Interesting. Shaparak, thank you very much for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thank you for covering the story. Thank you so much.
Coming up next, a CBC News investigation is looking into maternal deaths in this country.
It was such a disgrace that we lost my daughter. Kayla's death has to count for something.
Why some say the problem is worse than we really know. And a little later. A new romantic comedy is breaking down barriers and pushing the genre forward. Doctors and mothers are sounding an alarm tonight about the number of maternal deaths in this country and what's not being done to prevent them. Experts say Canada is undercounting cases. And as Tara Carmen explains, this country isn't doing enough to learn from the cases of women who died or from those who came dangerously close.
It was such a disgrace that we lost my daughter. Kayla's death has to count for something.
Are we failing to diagnose? Are we failing to predict? Are we failing to prevent?
Well, that's not fair. That's not fair to Canadians.
Every week counts. I almost died.
Nobody does anything about it. Nobody investigates. And that's what it's like here, really.
Canada's top OBs say maternal deaths are happening more than we're counting. And we're not learning from the women who have died or the thousands who have come close.
Ready? And now I'm gonna let go and you go run, run, run. Go, go, go. Go, go, go up the hill.
Claudia Wong and Dennis Bone are grateful for every moment with 2-year-old Sophie.
Now move your foot over.
As a nurse, Claudia was worried that her pregnancy pains were a sign of something more. Blurry vision, heartburn, back pain, and swelling. So she asked her doctor.
She had just said, you know, like, watch and wait. If it happens again, maybe let me know at our next appointment.
But she never got a chance. She passed out in the shower, was rushed to emergency. Lying on a gurney, she had a seizure. Was airlifted to a Toronto hospital. She had an emergency C-section, Wong under careful watch, baby Sophie in the NICU. Wong had eclampsia, a serious blood pressure condition that can lead to seizures.
Knowing what I know now, it feels especially terrible that no one talked to me about the possibility of preeclampsia or eclampsia. No one told me what signs to look for. For someone else, my symptoms may not have been significant. But for me, I almost died.
Knife, please.
Dr. John Barrett has been a high-risk OB in Canada. He says we have failed to learn from cases like Wong's for years, and there is no excuse for it. He calls them near misses.
And we have a little boy.
Hi, cutie.
You know, if you go to Pearson Airport and there was a near-miss plane crash, and nobody does anything about it, nobody investigates, or even a real plane crash, can you imagine? And that's what it's like here, really.
Just a few cities away from Wong, Patty Farnan is still reeling from the tragedy that shook her family.
The last picture that she and I ever took together, it was at her baby shower.
Bright young 25-year-old Kayla was excited to be a mom and just wanted to celebrate. But for weeks, she had felt sick. Headaches, swelling, nausea, and a nosebleed. Multiple trips to the hospital to get checked. Each time sent home to monitor.
She fully believed what they told her, that it was okay. She had been to the doctor so many times that she believed them.
But she wasn't okay. Days after her shower, Kayla was rushed back to the hospital, this time vomiting. She had an emergency C-section, then a seizure, then brain surgery to remove a clot. Kayla's baby survived, but she didn't. She'd had a severe form of preeclampsia called HELP syndrome. It can be diagnosed through blood work and urine tests. Tests her mom says were never done.
I don't understand why they wouldn't do it for her, other than the fact that maybe they just dismissed how she was feeling. It needs to change, and my selfish reason is that Kayla's death has to count for something in my eyes.
Two women, kilometers apart, different hospitals, similar conditions. One lived, one died. But why?
That's not fair. That's not fair to Canadians.
Dr. Jocelyn Cook is fighting to change the system because she believes that at least 60% of Canada's maternal deaths could be prevented. But we don't even know the basics of how many women die each year. On paper, Canada counts 523 maternal deaths over the last 20 years. But Cook says that number is wrong. She predicts over 820. The World Health Organization agrees with her. It assumes our rate is 60% higher than we report. So what are we doing wrong? The biggest problem is provincial death certificates. They're different in every province and are routinely filled in wrong. But it's about more than just counting. The federal government can't mandate provincial reviews, so Cook is trying to convince each province on her own.
Our ultimate goal is to have every maternal death in Canada out to 365 days, but we'll start with 42 days post-delivery, identified, captured, reviewed.
As it stands today, 7 provinces and territories don't have a review system in place.
If we knew more, would we have been able to make a difference in that outcome? That would absolutely be my worst fear. That we should know things, we have the ability to know things that could have changed that outcome.
Are we failing to diagnose? Are we failing to predict?
Dr. Rohan D'Souza says we already have the capacity to learn if hospitals would make their internal reviews public.
I cannot stress enough how important it is to communicate these findings. There is no point in having state-of-the-art review systems and keeping the knowledge to ourselves. And if it could happen in one institution, it can happen in another institution. Maybe it is. We don't want to reinvent the wheel here in Canada because these systems have been shown to work.
He's talking about the UK, where every death has been reviewed for the last 70 years, and severe complications have been reviewed since 2005. Their system has been so successful that the chances of a woman dying from preeclampsia or HELP in the UK are 1 in a million. Dr. Barrett trained in the UK, and he's felt the pain of losing a patient early in his career.
And I saw her every day and cared for her, got to know her family. And then she went into labour one night. She bled that much that we lost her.
And the UK inquiry into that woman's death meant future tragedy could be avoided.
But yet, somehow in Canada, we haven't managed to do this yet, which I think is a great shame.
The Minister of Health declined our request for an interview, but the Public Health Agency of Canada sent us a statement saying, while Canada's maternal death rate is low by international standards, surveillance can play a role in future prevention.
The worst part, I think, is the moral injury of seeing that there's something that could work and then knowing that that doesn't exist here. Why doesn't it exist here? Why are we okay with, hi baby, why are we okay with things being the way they are?
It was such a disgrace that we lost my daughter in such a way that it could have been salvageable. She could still be here.
Tara Carmen, CBC News, Vancouver.
So what comes next in the push to collect better data? Well, the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada has created a new toolkit for provinces to guide them on how to review maternal deaths. It's all being done with an eye to learning and saving lives. Well, coming up next, a fresh take on a romantic comedy.
I can do whenever and I can do whatever.
Cool, whatever, whenever. GIF of Michael Scott dancing. Office GIF? This person isn't gay.
Coming up, how a new wave of storytelling could be changing Hollywood. Plus, this is the woman who shares with her community the rewards of her favorite backyard hobby in our moment.
The reasons for this being are the treatment of American Indians today by the film industry. Excuse me.
The Indigenous activist at the heart of this historic moment has died. Sacheen Littlefeather declined Marlon Brando's 1973 Oscar on his behalf as he protested Native American stereotypes in Hollywood. An actor herself, she became a prominent advocate for Indigenous rights and health care. Littlefeather died of breast cancer at the age of 75. A groundbreaking new film has just made its debut in North American theaters. Bros opened this past weekend as the first gay romantic comedy from a major studio. Eli Glasner looks at a sign of the growing reach of strong, diverse voices.
I can do whenever and I can do whatever.
Cool, whatever, whenever. GIF of Michael Scott dancing.
Office GIF? This person isn't gay.
Bros is a look at modern relationships from the LGBTQ perspective.
My family already asked why we're not just together. All right.
There have been gay romantic comedies before, but not from a major studio.
Oh, God, I thought...
She's still here! No, goodbye! Your moment's over!
It's the brainchild of Billy Eichner, known to many as Billy on the Street. On the red carpet, he was still adjusting to his groundbreaking status.
We have obviously seen queer characters in mainstream films before, but...
No, I'm the first
No,
one.
the first!
But being first is hard.
It's the most challenging thing I've ever done. Luckily, I had Nick Stoller and Judd Apatow.
Feel the energy on this carpet.
Apatow, the producer of smash hits like Trainwreck and Bridesmaids, says Bros brought new talent to light.
There are so many people who are so hilarious and talented in this movie, and you do think, I wish I had already seen them in a ton of things.
Including Canadian Luke McFarlane, who previously played the straight love interest in Hallmark movies.
It's nice to be validated and get to do a story that's a little closer to my heart.
The proud, celebratory mood of Bros is part of a wider shift. From comedies such as Fire Island to a new wave of Canadian stories. Films such as Soft and Rosie, where queer characters are strong and not shunned.
You have big hands.
Oh my God.
Good.
I wanted to show
This queer Indigenous director says her characters Flo and Mo mirror her own journey.
they're unashamedly themselves and they let every part of their body hang out. I wanted to bring that in because that's what I experienced when I was in the 80s.
With the industry now embracing new voices, the wave of new views is just beginning.
You ain't seen the end of us yet.
Eli Glasner, CBC News, Toronto.
That is a weird dance.
This smiling soul is Carla Westbury. She wanted to spread some joy to people in a pretty colorful way by giving away flower arrangements and free of charge. So Carla's hobby of growing and arranging flowers brightens her day, so why not? She wanted to share that joy with others. That act of kindness is our moment.
I came across a picture of a flower stand on someone's front yard and I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to grow flowers and give them to people. I'm a single mom. I have 2 little ones and they're in school and I'm a registered nurse. I work full-time in labor and delivery. I'm fortunate that when I get my 5 days off, I kind of have this spare time to fulfill some hobbies and passions of mine. But once I discovered flowers, it kind of went from there. I'll typically make an announcement on my Instagram page that the stand will be going out just so people have an opportunity to come get them if they'd like. They're usually gone pretty quick. They don't last long. They're gone within an hour, typically.
I'm curious what's happening with these.
Are you sure I have a little bit of cash?
No, that's the whole point of it.
Okay, thank you.
Who doesn't want flowers? I haven't met a person whose day has not been lifted from getting flowers. And I just wanted to spread that. People deserve to have beautiful flowers, and why not for free? Why not? Look at that. You can do good in the world, and it doesn't have to be because you want something from it. It can just be because you want to show people that you care.
So, of course, we're talking about a nurse who's also giving back, as if her job isn't stressful enough and she doesn't give back enough. But also, of course, there are people there saying, no, let me pay. No, it's okay, let me pay. It feels like a very Canadian moment. That is a national for October the 3rd. Thank you for being with us.